hope these sheets are all in the right order. This is the last one that I have wrote up to the present time for my history, and I've called it Idaho. On the final day of summer school, the superintendent of schools from Pocatello came to the campus to give a crash course in Idaho subjects for all who expected to get an Idaho certificate to teach. The examination would be given the next week in Preston, Idaho, and would take 3 days, July 24th, 25th, 26th of 1924. Now, it just happened that those 3 days were also 3 days which Cache Valley was celebrating the centennial of the discovery of Cache Valley by the white men. A celebration had been in preparation for over a year, with parades, pageants, sports, and games. Men had grown whiskers, women had made sunbonnets and pioneer dresses. That with the national summer school had drawn the national media attention. Former residents of the valley were returning to be part of the celebration. I had to grow up in a hurry, because I had to miss the whole celebration, all 3 days, catch the early interurban cars going out of town at 8 a.m., returning at 6 p.m. at night, after each day's celebration was all over. I did meet some of my Dowdle relatives. In fact, Owen, Uncle Will's son, and his wife stayed in Newton and got me to the 8 a.m. train every morning to Preston. I got word that I passed the examinations, but I knew there were some blank spaces. Who was Sacagawea? I never heard of her, and they asked me on the examination who she was. I waited all that year for my certificate. It didn't come, but I was allowed to complete the year without it, but I did not go back again, and this is called Rockland. On Friday, September the 12th, 1924, Mama and Papa took me to the afternoon train at Cache Junction. As I found my seat, I finally became aware that I was really alone and on my own for the first time in my whole life. I didn't know where I was going. I had relatives in Pocatello and would leave the train in American Falls. From there on, everything was a blank. I didn't know what was ahead of me. I spent the first hour recording the names of the little towns along the way in my journal, my diary. It's still in that little book that I showed you. At one point I wrote, I wish the conductor knew how homesick he makes me when he keeps on whistling that tune. Aloha, oi, aloha, oi. And he did that all the way up the drag. Farewell to thee, farewell to thee. That's the Hawaiian national song. When they take someone to the boat and send them off, they sing that to them. I had heard that song sung by a group of Hawaiians in Utah for a general conference in the South Sea Islands reunion in Logan. On the next day, we were all on the same train going from Logan to Cache Junction. During that hour or more trip across the valley, the leader had taken out his big guitar, and the whole train full of people sang those beautiful Hawaiian songs, and they finally ended up singing Aloha Oi as we all prepared to leave the train. They were on their way back to their home on the islands, and I was just a little child that day, but I would never forget that moment. I stayed overnight that first night with the Curry family, resuming my journey the next morning. I had been told to find a certain drugstore in American Falls where I could find a ride out to Rockland with the mail truck, about 15 miles away. I didn't find such a drugstore on the main street of the city, so I had to inquire of someone, and they pointed to some buildings clear across an open space and across many railroad tracks about a quarter of a mile away. With my heavy luggage in hand, I made my way across those tracks and over to the store. Yes, this was the right place, and yes, the mail left from here to go to Rockland, but I'd have to wait for it for about 2 hours. And there was no place to go but sit in that drugstore. The mail truck and Mr. Reed came. On the way to the village, in the middle of the big dry farms, Mr. Reed told me he was an active member of the church, and that it was a friendly, pleasant time, and that Mrs. Reed was a niece of Mrs. Minear. That was a good start. At Rockland, I met Mrs. Taylor, the postmistress and friend of everyone, and sometimes nurse and doctor in emergencies. I had also heard a few weeks before from Mrs. Wimmer, offering me board and room, and so I asked Mrs. Taylor where I could find Mrs. Wimmer, and she came out and pointed her finger at the house over there. I just had to follow a little footpath, cross lots, through knee-high weeds, and I would come to the end of my journey. Over the weekend, I met Mrs. Minear's husband, Virgil, and young son, David, the church, and much of the Mormon part of the population, and Bishop May. He told me that he had had a letter from my mother telling him I was coming, and would he see that all was well with her daughter. That was a surprise to me. I wasn't alone in my apprehensions. I was used to life in a small farming community, so I had no problem with that. The people were warm and friendly, but I did find some ill will between the Mormons and the non-Mormons in the town, but it was not very serious. I was apprehensive about starting school. I would be teaching the same students 5th through 8th grades as Mrs. Minear. We just traded rooms and taught subjects that we'd been assigned. I had much to learn, but Mrs. Minear was a bulwark. The children were lovely, but some were taller than my father, let alone me. The building was a 2-story structure up on the hill above town. High school was on the 2nd floor with 4 teachers, and the elementary was on the 1st floor with 4 rooms and 8 grades. Schools in Idaho were not consolidated, so each town had its own school board. Mr. Morris was president of the board, the owner of the only store, and performed the service of a banker for our chicks. After a few nervous wrecks, I learned to enjoy the work. Became active in the ward, enjoyed associating with the people, and got over my homesickness. The only problem was Mrs. Wimmer, who gave her husband and children a bad time continually, and the chief subject of her conversations during meals were that old Joe Smith, that Mormon prophet. We finally had to leave her, and I went to live with the Minears.